how do we classify these people, these groups, and how much use is there in that?
Oh, I think there's enormous use in it. First of all, some of the terms we use have legal consequences.
Right.
For example, when you invoke the term terrorist, which has been used quite a bit today. But first of all, I think we should pin culpability on the Republican Party and the man who heads the Republican Party, Donald J. Trump, in the first instance. He gave this rabble-rousing speech before the storming of the Capitol and basically encouraged folks to do so. And of course, a few days ago, he said that there would be this, quote, wild, unquote, protest at the Capitol. And therefore, we should blame him. And then the Capitol Police, for example, who either exhibited incompetence or complicity. I've seen the very disturbing images of them acting very chummy with these seditionists, with these insurrectionists. And also, given the nature of your audience, I would be remiss if I failed to acknowledge some of the weaknesses of the US left when it comes to confronting this fascist reality. For example, there's a tendency in the US left to suggest that when some of us talk about fascism and the fascist threat, we're just creating a boogeyman that provides cover for the Democrats. Well, I hope that they were watching what was going on today. But more than that, the US left has not been able to develop an analysis that would explain why the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the alt-right, the QAnon continue to proliferate. And I think that if they were to do an honest assessment of US history, they would acknowledge that this settler colonial regime that was begun in the early 1600s in what was called Virginia involved class collaboration from the first instance between richer Europeans, particularly from London, who sponsored these poorer Europeans. And the class collaboration oftentimes involved the richer and the poor collaborating in terms of seizing the land of the Native Americans. And that particular dynamic has continued to surge forth and also sheds light on what some people have commented on today, which is how Black Lives Matter protesters are treated so differently, because the enslaved African population from the beginning was engaged in class struggle, which went against the ethos of class collaboration, and you still have that conflict today. If I were to be writing a history of these events, one of the things I would point out is that it's not coincidental that you had this victorious election in Georgia the day before, not only with regard to Reverend Warnock, a Black person winning, given the atrocious history of Jim Crow and lynching in Georgia, but also a Jewish man, Joel Ossoff, about 110 years ago or so. Leo Frank, a Jewish man, was lynched in Georgia in the same precincts that now has sent a Jewish man, Joel Ossoff, to the US Congress. And I don't think that the alt-right necessarily sees that as an irrelevant detail, given the profundity of their anti-Black racism, the profundity of their anti-Semitism. And I should also say that this protest is going to have international consequences. What I mean is that already you see that the European Union is unwilling to sign on to Cold War II that Mr. Trump has initiated with China and what Mr. Biden plans to carry forward with. You just had a few days ago, the European Union and the Chinese inked an investment deal that's bringing them closer together. The European Union apparently feels that Trumpism is not a passing fancy. Unlike the US left, they see it as a perhaps ongoing part of the political landscape. They don't necessarily see it as relevant whether or not the folks who are voting for Trump are being duped or they're being complicit. The fact is that they're supporting a kind of neo-fascism, which has implications for their populaces on the eastern bank of the Atlantic. And so this demonstration, I dare say, will go down in history as being one of the most significant protests that have taken place, or fascist coups that have taken place, attempted fascist coups in world history. And we should also put this in the war context. Recall that just a few weeks ago, we were reading about Lansing, Michigan, and how ultra-rightists were supposedly planning to storm the Capitol, to firebomb it, take hostages, And of course, a sideline was to kidnap the governor, Gretchen Whitmer, who had been attacked by Mr. Trump by name, and then put her on trial with a so-called tribunal and execute her. We also have heard an
He's also
idea.
Jewish. I didn't know that, by the way, until
really,
recently.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. We've also heard these stories coming out of Washington today about loose talk about military tribunals. We saw the gallows erected on the grounds of the Capitol with a noose. How are they able to erect a gallows with a noose without the Capitol Police stopping them? Particularly when we recall that just a few years ago, a Black woman was shot dead by the Capitol Police as she was approaching the Capitol. So this particular incident is very revelatory with regard to the nature of politics in the United States as we speak. We need a thorough congressional investigation, not least of the Capitol Police and their either incompetence or complicity. And we should not discourage those who are seeking to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove this particular incompetent, nor should we discourage Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who is drawing up articles of impeachment as we speak.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think I'm guilty of that too. I think that there is a liberal strain of a historic kind of downplaying of racism, white supremacy, xenophobia that makes, Trump seem, because Trump is both unprecedented and precedented, right? I mean, this is something I think I've talked about with you, Dr. Horne, and how he's a departure in some ways, but he's also not a departure. But I know that what you were saying is true. Like I struggle with that because I think there is such hysteria often around the wrong things with Trump. And they don't look at the policy. They don't look at how the Dems are signing his Pentagon budget. But it also, like, discourse does matter. And Trump's words matter. And how he incites his followers also matter. And I think there is a bit of, and I say this as someone, I'm coming out as a leftist who can kind of dismiss that and focus more on how much the Dems, and the Dems do totally enable Trump. And Trump is around because of the Dems. But I do think that it's true. Like, we have to figure out how to, as you said on the show on Sunday, walk and chew gum at the same time.
Absolutely. I mean, because the dimensions of what happened today, quite frankly, are mind-boggling. Thousands of people invading the Capitol, parading around the halls of Congress with Confederate flags. A victory for the Slovocracy, which was defeated in 1865, we thought, but whose legacy continues to pockmark the landscape. The fact that open QAnon and Proud Boy supporters were parading as if they owned the Capitol. And interestingly enough, before this incident, what I forgot to mention on Sunday when we were talking about the prospect of January 6th, I had also thought that a particular scenario that we needed to be aware of was the kind of wave the dog scenario. For example, if you look at the Drudge report yesterday, he was suggesting that there would be an Iranian attack on the Capitol,
right,
and that this would then allow for Trump to wage war against the Iranians, perhaps declare a state of emergency, or like Lieutenant Colonel Michael Flynn has suggested, invoke the Insurrection Act, etc. I was expecting that kind of scenario much more than what we saw today, and which is more dangerous, I'm afraid to say, than the Iranian scenario.
Dr. Horne, any final thoughts you have about what needs to be done?
Well, first of all, there are cameras all over the Capitol. There's video of these miscreants. I fully expect the prosecutorial authorities to bring charges against the perpetrators. We know that if a person is killed during the process of some people committing a felony, that means that everybody involved in committing that felony can be prosecuted for murder for this person who was killed. I assume that the prosecutors in Washington, D.C. will look at that. We also should pay close attention to the fact that there were simultaneous outbursts in the state of Washington and Sacramento and the state of Kansas. There was a certain kind of coordination with regard to what's going on. And the term conspiracies somehow has taken on an unpleasant odor, but a conspiracy is only an agreement by two or more people to commit an illegal act. And I think that that also should be looked at by the prosecutors. And finally, once again, with regard to history, oftentimes even our radical friends assume that progressive change, such as the abolition of slavery, the retreat of Jim Crow, that this is embraced universally. Sorry to say that it's not, and that it's inevitable that these kinds of counter-revolutionary protests and fascist-minded uprisings take place, because what used to happen, say, for example, to my ancestors was fascist-like, and it was inevitable as that particular chain of oppression was loosened, that the idea would be let loose that perhaps fascist-like approaches should be addressed or directed to the rest of the population, which is, I'm afraid to say, what the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the alt-right, the 3%ers have in mind.
But are you, I mean, this is a tricky issue, right? Because there's often civil liberties and there's a collision between civil liberties and, in other words, I don't think felony murder I'm not a fan of felony murder as a prosecutorial tool, but I understand that it's totally applied in an unfair way. But this is kind of like, yeah, right.
What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. We know that if these had been Black Lives Matter,
of course, yeah.
Somebody had been killed, they would have the book thrown at them. And in any case, like the late Woody Guthrie, who used to say, "My guitar kills fascists," I embrace that same spirit, which means that you should throw the book at fascist uprisings whenever you have the opportunity.
Got it. Yeah. Oh, interesting. We'll have to have a debate about that. Because I think then that becomes, I think that, I mean, one could argue it's a deterrent, but it also can normalize something. And our focus should be on like freeing other people or getting people out of jail as opposed to putting more in. And
I would like to see more fascists off the streets right now, because I think they present a clear and present danger to the rest of us. And they are receiving support from the top. They have international support. I'm sure you saw that article in the New York Times a few days ago about fascist infiltration of the police and the military in Germany. We have a similar phenomenon taking place here in the United States of America. There have been books written about how the fascists have been infiltrating the US military. We all know that many of these alt-rightists, so-called, they're former military men who learned in Afghanistan and Iraq that you resolve political disputes through the barrel of a gun, and they've taken that lesson back home with chickens coming home to roost.
Right. You said that on another show, that the Boogaloo Boys in many ways is imperialism, right? It's turned inward. It's chickens coming home to roost. And yeah, I think that's true. So, well, we'll have to have you back on to debate. Maybe my co-host Matt Taibbi and you can debate strengthening the surveillance state. Thank you so much, Dr. Horne. And we are going to have him on so soon to talk about his latest book, The Bittersweet Science.
Right. Thank you.